I wanted to first ask you about the museum, what it is that you do. You're known as the museum guy, so that's a pretty cool name. And people would like to know what it is exactly that you do, what kind of tours, and what do you specialize in?
I like to say, this is like my sales pitch is basically I take all of that money that we pour into Jewish education, all that tuition, and I put it together and bring it alive and make it come alive through museums. So I basically use the museum as a stage for combining everything from Judaic studies to general studies to bring them together into a kind of a holistic view that brings Torah and Jewish history and Tanakh to life and really makes it engaging and fun and relevant. And you really see how our history connects to so many different things. So that's what I do through the museum.
Fantastic.
So in a nutshell, that means I do tours, but
right.
It's much more than tours.
So there are multiple museums I'm sure you take people to, right? It's not just one.
Yeah, I actually started this at the Met in New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Mm-hmm. I did a Tanakh tour for my middle schoolers. I was teaching at Netivot Montessori in East Brunswick. This is 2015, I think. And I prepared this tour, so I went a few times. My father, who's also a tour guide and an archaeologist, encouraged me to go see this special exhibit about Middle Egypt. So it's going to connect to our Mitzrayim Pesach story. But I went to this exhibit and I did not know what was flying. My father said, Middle Egypt, it's important. The middle period, and like the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the Old Kingdom, all that meant completely nothing to me. Like I knew about Pharaoh, and that's about it, right? Right. So I prepared this Tanakh tour, and I must have gone twice to the Met, and then I brought my students there. I did this tour in the Assyrian Babylonian galleries. It was a full day. We did a tour for that. We took a break, had lunch, and then did an art in the museum. I have background in art. We did some painting, whatever. So that was it. I never thought about it again. And when I was visiting Israel back in the day, I kind of had a thought of, you know what, I'm going to open up a YouTube channel to show teachers how to use Israel's geography and archaeology to enhance their lessons on Tanakh and Jewish history. And so this is the summer of 2016. I spent 2 months in Israel, like jam-packed with going to archaeological sites, interviewing archaeologists, going to different museums, doing this, doing that. And then I came back to this, and I'm actually, before I came back to the States, I met with one of my professors in Bar Ilan, and I told him what I was up to, and he was the department head of communications. So I thought he would be excited about this idea of YouTube. And he said, I don't really see how this is gonna work for you financially, but I think you should emphasize those museum tours. So like, you know what? He has a point. So I made a few phone calls, went back to the Met, and long story short, I started doing tours in the Met, like 2016, 2017. And that's where it was born. One thing led to another. I now do museums virtually worldwide and physically wherever I travel. If I'm in the States, I've done about a dozen museums in North America, including Canada. And I've done the British Museum, the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, and in Israel, there's several museums, primarily the Israel Museum and the Bible Lands Museum, but a few other ones as well.
So when your father took you to the museum and you weren't aware, were you instantly intrigued? Like, I got to learn this stuff and I want to, become like a professional at this?
No, to be honest, no. I mean, I like museums. I've gone many times. I didn't really see how it worked. And I think it was this special exhibition about the Middle Kingdom, which really gave me a spark, which later turned into tours that I'm doing. And this is how it happened. You can appreciate, let's say, the power of ancient Egypt, looking at the pharaohs, looking at their wealth. That's all nice. But once you go into a higher resolution, I didn't know what the difference is between the middle, like who cares about the Middle Kingdom? What is the Middle Kingdom? Right. I didn't know what to do with that information. And here's where it clicked. My father, first of all, told me go to the exhibit. I went on my own. And then when I went with him, he came to visit. He came to the States for, I think, mid-November. There's this international archaeology convention in Chicago, based from Chicago, called ASOR, the American study of Oriental research, something like that. There's a it's like the archaeology convention. So it's based on the University of Chicago, and sort of it travels. So he came for there. He came to America, and he came to New York to visit me, and then he pointed out to me, look, you see this kingdom. This is from the time of Yehoshua. This is from the time of the Avot. This is from the time of Knisa La'aretz. And suddenly something clicked, and I realized, like, okay, this is the context for Jewish history, and now I'm able to sort of organize, as we say, La'asot Seder. Like, suddenly it's not just all 3,000-4,000 years of ancient Egypt. It's like, this is the period that relates to this. This is the period that relates to that. Now I can start zooming in and doing something with it. So that was my first glimpse into what later became, really understanding the context for Tanakh and Jewish history through different periods of history and through archaeology. It all started with this exhibition with Egypt.
Very interesting. And the thing that you brought up right now about the Middle Kingdom. So actually, there was a documentary I watched a few years ago, The Patterns of Evidence.
Yes.
And they, it was the first time I actually saw something. And I think Kenneth Kitchen also discusses this in his books. But that they theorize that everybody's dating it wrong. That's why, like, Egyptologists and biblical scholars and everybody do not think, a lot of them think that this is not a historical event.
Right.
But when you move everything to the correct time, which is the Middle Kingdom, then everything adds up, everything fits.
Right.
So, that to me was very intriguing. If you have anything to say about that, please feel free. I recommend to anybody else to watch that documentary. It's very intriguing.
Yeah, there's a few of those out there. There's Riddle of the Exodus by Jim Long, who's a Noahide. You can look at noahide.com. He's a nice guy, lives in Texas. Texas or Kansas? I think he lives in Texas. The question, I'm not going to go into the resolution of Kitchen versus other scholars because it's complicated, but the main issue is, are we looking in the right place chronologically? That is indeed the question. It gets complicated, especially like if you look at Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman. I know you had a show with him recently. He wrote his book Ani Mamin about biblical archaeology and the 13 principles of faith, the Rambam. Mm-hmm. But he talks about dating the Exodus. He actually holds that the Exodus was in the New Kingdom, which is after the Middle Kingdom, which we mentioned. Right. The New Kingdom is two dynasties. It's the 18th dynasty and the 19th dynasty, and he places it with Ramses the Great, which is what many scholars hold. And there's a lot of problems with that, and one of them is that it takes the 400 and, let's say, 40 or 80 years. Depending on if you're looking at Book of Kings or Divrei Yamim or Melachim, or Chronicles or Kings, you're looking at taking all of that time from the Exodus all the way to the Solomon's Temple and cutting it in half just to make Ramses work. So you can answer that with typological numbers, and numbers represent this. You could play with that. The difficulty is that wherever you move the Exodus, you're going to run into problems with what happened before or what happened after in terms of dates, years, numbers, right? So it gets complicated. Mm-hmm. But the point is, are we looking in the right place? And there's good reasons to say Ramses, yes. For example, the name of the city, Pi Ramses, because we built Pitom in Ramses. So that's the earliest mention of Ramses in Egyptian history is Ramses. He's Ramses the II, and there's Ramses the First. Fine, but the point is that it's in that neighborhood. You don't find it in the Middle Kingdom or in the 18th dynasty. So that's part of it. But you run into other problems. Therefore, there are others who suggest, not necessarily as like Kitchen does hundreds of years earlier, but just like 200 years earlier, in the 18th dynasty, we all know the famous King Tut, right? Tutankhamun. So we're talking about his great grandfather as Amenhotep II, or the third as being more or less the period of time in which and then everything else works out. But I will say this is something that people don't pay attention to so much in the conversation. They just look into Egypt. They don't look at what do we know about what's happening in the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, at the same time. And one of the problems is, if you want to, I'm oversimplifying this, but if you want to see what's happening in Israel and align that with what our forefathers were doing, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they're in Hebron. There's a king in Gerar. There's these people here, those cities there. Like that's the playing field. Then we go down to Egypt. Then we come into the land with Yehoshua. And this is the reality that we find with these particular fortified cities, the city of Chatzor this, the city of Hebron that, right? And you have to look at what's happening there and try to align that with Egypt. And when you do the new kingdom, 19th dynasty, Ramses controlled most of the coast of Israel all the way up to Bet She'an during the time that presumably, if he was the Exodus, Egypt was decimated. They lost their grip and control over the coast of Israel. And we come into the land of Israel and don't hear anything about Egypt, right? It's basically like you're going from Egypt back into Egypt's hands if you hold that Ramses the Great is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So that's one of the problems with it. If you push it back 200 years to the new kingdom, indeed, after that, there was a steep decline. They lost their control over the area. It fits with the material culture of coming into the land of Israel. And then Ramses, okay, so the Egyptians regained a little bit of control, but we didn't have a lot to do with the coast in the time of the Shoftim later. So the judges. So again, there's pros and cons for each one of these. Egyptian chronology is complicated. It's not, it doesn't use the system that the Assyrians or Babylonians use, that you can really date things so easily and just stack them up back to back. Egyptian chronology is complicated. So just to summarize,
but in the Torah, specifically in the book of Bereshit in Genesis, we have like multiple pharaohs, and they're all called Pharaoh, right? They're all called Pharaoh. They don't have actual names, and we see even from what always intrigued me was that there was a Pharaoh that, the time of when the Jews were in Egypt, when everyone was there, there was a Pharaoh that came that didn't know Yosef. So it actually always made me think, like, how can there be a Pharaoh that didn't know Yosef? He must have been very famous, but that may align with the Hyksos dynasty that came in, who were outsiders of Canaanite origin, and they were Semitic people, and it could be possible that that's what it's referring to. That's why it makes sense. And that's why when Moshe ended up having to run away and he came back, there was a new Pharaoh, and he was cool with Moshe. He didn't have a problem with him coming back. So I always wondered what was going on over there. I don't know if you have any theories.
Of course. I do actually. I'm going to refer back to the main source, by the way, that I was presenting in terms of putting the Exodus, Yetziat Mitzrayim, in the 18th dynasty, roughly the year 1400 BCE as opposed to 1200 BCE, like in the ballpark, is the same opinion that deals with this. It's Yitzchak Meitlis, who's an archaeologist, lives here in Israel, and Yitzchak Meitlis is one of the scholars who points that out. Let me take us. We're looking also at Google Maps, so I'm showing us the neighborhood that we're talking about, and that's how I'm going to answer the question. So the Hyksos, which is a mispronunciation, you can see a Greek pronunciation of Heka Chasut, which means basically foreign invaders, are people who have recently been shown to originate from the northern Levant. In other words, north of Israel. It's still within the borders of, you can say, Canaan, which is a general area, but they're nothing to do with us, that's for sure. But they invaded Egypt, and they're basically Dynasty 17. Dynasty 17, if I'm not mistaken, or is it 15? It might be Dynasty 15, and then 16 and 17 are contemporary Egyptian dynasties, which were weak, which were further south, right? So I think it's Dynasty 15, I think. So the 15th dynasty would be the Hyksos, Heka Chasut, and they invaded from the north and basically inhabited this area of the Nile Delta with their capital at a place called Avaris. Now, since they were foreign invaders, it would be a more friendly environment for foreigners who migrated, who came here. There was a famine. They came to rely on the Nile. It was the superpower of the region. It was more friendly to foreigners. It's fathomable, it's conceivable to have a foreigner as a viceroy like Yosef, which would never be imagined in Egypt. And the the turnover from what's known as the second intermediate period, which is this, the Hikos, to the new kingdom is with one pharaoh who established the 18th dynasty, established the new kingdom. His name is Yahmes. In English, we say Achmose, but Mose is like Moses, Moshe. It's like similar to the name Moshe. So Yahmes, he's an Egyptian, and he establishes the new kingdom and is able to banish the Hyksos. So according to Maitlis, at least, and there's some that follow him, like Yolelitzur, the fact that there could be a pharaoh who does not know Yosef is because Yosef was part of these invaders who settled, like he was friends with them. He was part of them. They were absorbed into that kingdom, who are now banished. And you see this as the concern when Pharaoh says, like, what's going to happen if we're invaded again and they'll join our enemies? And then, like there's so many of them, let's find a strategy to preempt this problem.
So it must be that the Pharaoh that said that was speaking about a previous Hyksos invasion. Obviously, he's the Nubian Pharaoh again. So
not Nubian, New Kingdom.
New Kingdom, I meant. Sorry.
Yeah. There were Nubian pharaohs, but that's Dynasty 25 in the time of Chizkiyahu. That's major. That's a really, really major story. It's a different story. Much later.
For a different time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So so go on. You were saying, so what happened after this Pharaoh warns of the invaders that are coming in? We don't want this to happen. We want to do population control.
Right. So you do a population control. Now this area, we're looking at a map of the Nile Delta, northern Egypt, and to the right of the green area is what's the Sinai Peninsula, which in Tanakh is really three different deserts. There's Midbar Tzim, Midbar Paran, Midbar Sinai, Midbar Chorev, that is. But we call this the Sinai Peninsula. And the northwest part of the Sinai Peninsula is sort of borders with the Nile Delta. That's Eretz, that going west into the Nile Delta is Eretz Goshen. So that's where the Hebrews are. I'm not getting into all the how to deal with the numbers of people, right?
We did that with Joshua Berman.
Yeah. Right. So that's it's a complicated area. I don't want to go in there, but this is where we were settled. And also that, by the way, people think we built the pyramids of Giza. I mean, if you look at the Nile Delta, you'll see that the location of the Great Pyramids of Giza are where the Nile Delta meets the Nile Valley, which is further south. That's not where we were. And besides, they're not cities, they're not storehouses, they're simply mausoleums. So it's cute to think so because of Ceci B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, but it's really not related. We have nothing to do with the pyramids. The pyramids were there hundreds of years before Abraham ever visited Egypt. They were there.
Yeah, I heard a joke once that the Jews didn't build the pyramids, but they definitely got the contract, So.
Well, we want you to build a square building this high, so you make it a triangle, you save on materials. There's a lot of jokes about that. Yeah. But the point is that if you place Yahmes, the founder of the new kingdom, as the beginning of the Exodus, that fits perfectly with about 210 years later having an Exodus. And that fits with the 18th dynasty. And then Ramses is sort of happening when we are already in Israel, where there's a small population. It's the time of the judges, the Shoftim, and that fits with the material culture of the time in Israel, because there's a very famous inscription, the earliest mention of Israel in archaeology. Are you familiar?
Merneptah stele?
Yeah, Merneptah. And we're talking about the descendant of Ramses the Great, who talks about getting rid of the seed of Israel from the land. And it's like, if Ramses the Great was just defeated, we just left and came into Israel, there isn't that much of seed of Israel settled in the land to talk about for 40 years later. There's nothing to talk about. So it doesn't fit. That's one of the reasons it doesn't fit. I mean, I'm sure that Rabbi Berman has answers for that, but the point is it's not an easy, it's not easy to put it all together. Mm-hmm. But I find it very compelling when looking at the archaeology in Israel and the Hikos being banished and the establishing of the new kingdom and not knowing Yosef. That's why I find that the more convincing answer. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar enough with the details about Kitchen placing it in the Middle Kingdom to be able to really give to reflect on that.
Okay. Very interesting. So now, what about what do we know about the Pharaohs that lived in the time of when Moshe came back, obviously when he left and he went to Midian and then he came back. Do we speculate about which Pharaoh that was?
We speculate that if we're following Maitlist, then we're talking about Amenhotep II or the third. He's a powerful pharaoh. He has the kingdom together. I don't know. We know a lot about what he's done. I'm not familiar with the details to such high resolution, but we have a good idea of who he was, and we know that Egypt suffered a significant decline right after him, and they lost their grip on the coast of Israel. We have Akhenaten, who is Amenhotep IV. Mm-hmm. So we have Akhenaten, known as the heretic, who attempted to cause some kind of religious revolution. Everybody has to worship the Aten, the hidden sun disk, and basically he weakened the country's military by focusing on religious issues as opposed to focusing on their military campaigns. That caused a lot of damage to the kingdom. So we know that they suffered loss after that, even though they had a period of prosperity before that.
So what I see also is that, a lot of Egyptologists and historians will say there is no evidence for the Exodus. And then you hear people say, well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And then there are those who say, like Joshua Berman, there's so much evidence that they're there. So and also
evidence of absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence is a bit of a weak argument.
Sure.
And it doesn't really convince anyone, especially when it depends also where you're looking and what culture, but in general, in antiquity, there are always going to be traces of buildings. It's very rare that you don't find anything. You'll find something. So if you don't find anything, then you have a story, right? But when you talk about the Exodus, so the question is, what kind of evidence are you looking for or expecting to find? So what would convince you, not necessarily you, but what would convince you that the Exodus happened, right? So we would expect the strongest form of evidence is written evidence, something written down. Mm-hmm. Now, there are those who talk about the very famous Ipuwer papyrus of some priest in Egypt who writes about some catastrophes befalling Egypt. Some of them, if you're very, very nitpicky, some of them could be twisted to make them look like some of the 10 plagues, okay? But it's a very selective reading, and it's far off in terms of the timing. It's way too early. So maybe that fits with the New Kingdom. I'm not really sure if Kitchen talks about that. I have seen that in Riddles of the Exodus. I don't find it convincing, but it's interesting, okay? But we know for a fact, and this Rabbi Berman talks about this actually, that the most written about, well-documented battle of the ancient world is the battle between the Egyptians and the Hittites, Ramses II, Ramses the Great, and Shupululuyuma, I think, but basically the Hittites in the north.
The Battle of Kadesh, right?
The Battle of Kadesh, right, which is, he made a monument in southern Egypt. Abu Simbel, he was just there on tour with people. I've seen some pictures on Facebook. I wish I could have gone. And he made this monument to celebrate and to on the border, the southern border of Egypt, to warn the Nubians, look what I just did. Now, we know for fact that he barely escaped with his life from that battle, and yet he made it look like he did it all. Egyptians, as opposed to Mesopotamian kings, Egyptians focused very much on making themselves look good and omitting anything which may suggest that they look bad. Right? The Assyrians, in contrast, would actually write about their failures, because how else are you supposed to learn about and not repeat them? But the Egyptians had no concern like that, from what we know, as from a lot of their writings. So we have the whole picture, and we have both sides writing about the story. We have their treaties and all that stuff. So you can't trust Egyptians to properly write about anything which wouldn't make them look good. So what would you expect them to write about, right? In terms of defeat, in terms of mentioning a Jewish population, just in terms of the writing part, okay? Egyptians, first of all, writing was part of the elite class. Scribes were highly trained, very wealthy individuals. They kept the tradition in the family, and they were employed by kings and by officials and state officials. The common person probably didn't even know how to read hieroglyphics, right? Hieroglyphics are used only for holy purposes, whereas the handwritten form called Demotic script, which we find more in the Greek period, in the Hellenistic period, that's the handwritten form. We don't even know if the common person knew how to read that. You have to remember that daily life was very difficult for people. The chances of people having the luxury to study the very, very difficult discipline of the scribal art, it's like, when would they have the time for that? You work in the field, you have to help the family business, you have to toil. So there's no time for that. It's a luxury that they didn't have. They knew stuff by heart, right? They knew the stories, they knew them, but they didn't really know how to read and write on average. And that's a general assumption about the ancient world, which every once in a while we find something that challenges that to an extent, right? But that relates more to dating Israel and the kingdom of Israel. We're not talking about that right now. Why would they even bother writing about a colony of slaves, right? It's not the kind of thing anyone would bother giving the time of day, okay? Mm-hmm. So that's in terms of writing. In terms of material culture, what would you expect to find? Assuming we're identifying Eretz Goshen correctly, a lot of this area has been submerged. There's changes in the currents and the water. We keep on finding entire cities underground, right? Assuming we lived somewhere in this area, we would be living in mud houses. We found some things like that. I'm not sure about the details, but I'm not really sure what you would expect to find, right? So that being said, you might expect to see periods of strength and weakness in Egypt that we do find. We find that in several tides, right? It comes and goes. So we have such periods. That what's going on in the land of Israel is the back end of that. So that we do have a conversation there. Even there's a lot of gray areas, things that we don't know, things that we do know. Are we properly identifying which city was conquered and destroyed? At what layer of destruction do we? So we have a lot of that. So in terms of material culture, it's hard to expect to find a lot of things. That takes us to two other types of evidence. One of them is cultural, or you can say anthropological evidence, and I'll get to that in a moment. And then we have how accurately does the Tanakh reflect the reality of Egypt? And it's very clear, and we can go into details soon, that from the story of the Exodus in Tanakh, it's very on point, even in very, very nuanced details, using the language of Egypt, the symbolisms of Egypt, the 10 plagues, for example. You can really go into each plague and see how this plays a role in sort of attacking the Egyptian worldview, which focused tremendously on the Nile and on the Pharaoh, right? Which I hope to get to soon, right? And I like to call it a 10-step therapy session, right? Or 10-step therapy program, because that's really the point, which is like openly stated. This is the reason that God is telling Pharaoh, this is the reason I'm giving you the power to endure all of this, in order that you shall learn my power and you should tell my name throughout the world. So like, this is to send a message that Pharaoh doesn't run the world as the Egyptians were convinced. He's like a God who runs the Nile, runs the world. We need to appreciate how deeply rooted that notion was to understand why they needed an entire year of step by step challenging those beliefs, right? To the point where the Pharaoh ends up realizing that he's living a lie. So the verses in Tanakh, we can give some examples, like Berman, for example, talks about Shirat Hayam as having some sort of communication with the story of Ramses's camp and the Battle of Kadesh, which that's one of the things that are beautiful about it. He has a good point where, like, why would you be using references to something that wasn't known at the time, right? Unless it was known at the time. That doesn't work with the 18th dynasty. So I don't have an answer for that. But again, it's complicated. But in terms of the biblical text, again, there's a lot of very accurate description of the milieu, the environment of Egypt, down to very small details. And then in terms of anthropological, I think I wanted to use a different word, not ethnic, anthropologic, maybe ethnic. Anyway, the point is that we have Jewish communities around the world who have been separate for thousands of years, and they're all telling the same story. Ben Gurion used to say this to people who challenge living in Israel. He would say, do you know when your ancestors arrived on the Mayflower? And people scratch their heads. I don't know. When did we leave Egypt? Oh, everybody knows, on the 14th of Nisan, right? Everybody knows, the 15th of Nisan. Like, the very fact that this has been maintained in traditions throughout thousands of years, traditions which have been separate from before the destruction of the first temple. We're talking about Yemenite Jews, right? All over the place. And we have this story already gives it a very, that's a different kind of evidence as well. So
it's a national memory that
yes.
Every single Jew, like, no one ever stood up and said, well, this didn't happen to me, or this didn't happen to my ancestors. I don't know what you're talking about. We just invented this holiday. It was from day one, there was, and what's interesting about Judaism, for those listening, is that it's the only religion to make the claim of a mass revelation at Sinai. So again, there's family members mentioned, there's a census, there's people, these are actual, it's very, very, so there's a lot of integrity there, because you're using family names and people, and you're saying, hey, this is what happened right now. And like you said, it's something that we've, maintained, and we can trace it back to that day.
Yeah. And in addition to that, there's even on the linguistic level, this is something really fascinating that I heard from Professor Aaron Dembski at Bar-Ilan University. He's more of a linguist. He speaks about names in Tanakh, and he pointed it out. This is I'm mentioning something from Genesis 14, Bereshit Yudalad, which has to do with the war that Abraham had with all these kings from throughout Mesopotamia. But I think the point is valid to Egypt as well, and to the general concept of evidence of the antiquity of stories. It mentions there Kedar Laomer, the king of Elam, Arioch, the king of Elasar, which we assume is Larsa, near Babylon or closer to the Persian Gulf, and so on and so forth. And he points out something beautiful, the name Kedor Laomer. So in the study of ancient names, we have different elements of names, right? We have like a theophoric name, like we have like the name, God's name in our name, in Hebrew names, whereas Canaanite names are going to have the name Baal in them, because Baal is the head, one of the important gods in the Canaanite pantheon. So, for example, we have Izebel, right, the queen who married Achav, and she's the daughter of Etbaal. We have Hannibal, right, Hannibal of the Carthaginians. They're originally Phoenicians who traveled to North Africa, right? So the name Baal shows up again and again. We have God's name, right? So there's different elements. The element of the name Kedor Laomer, is an element which belongs to the Kassite Babylonian kingdom. For example, Hammurabi, he's from the Kassite Babylonian kingdom. That element was unknown to historians and archaeologists until maybe 100, 150 years ago, and when it was uncovered. We didn't know anything about it. None of this was known in the period of time, like the Hellenistic period, where some scholars suggest that the book of Genesis was written, right? And like, it doesn't fit, because nobody could have made up that name and then placed it in that location and given it to a name of a king. Like, we found that name. We also found Tid'al Melech Goyim. Tid'al is Tudchalia. We found his name as well, right? So there's the names carry a history in them as well, which point to a very ancient story. So when we have the names in Egypt, right, and even Jewish names, like the name Pinchas is an Egyptian name. The name Moses is an Egyptian name, which the Torah sort of gives an origin story to. Like, it gives it a name which connects it to the Hebrew, Kimin Amai Meshitihu, right? But it's originally an Egyptian name, right? According to Divrei Yamim, his name was Tuvia. There's a conversation about that. But these names are ancient, they're Egyptian, and they fit, right, in many different interesting ways. So it shows up in all kinds of other areas.
And his name means son of, which is interesting.
I think so.
Yeah, he doesn't have like Ramesses. They all have
like
the
Ramesses, the son of Ra.
Son of Ra, and he's the son of, but he appeared in a basket. So I think Nahum Sarna talks about this, that he's really the son of, of Pharaoh, because he didn't have a father in that sequence.